was not responding.
Great.
Friends, it is so good to see so many of you on screen. Welcome on this, at least down here in Decatur, Georgia, gray, rainy Friday afternoon. My name is Helen Blyer. I am going to be facilitating the webinar today and working behind the scenes to get questions, comment on things, work with people who are having issues, etc. I serve as the president of the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, ALM as it's called. We are a think tank resource provider and community of practice for everybody out there who leads some kind of continuing education or lifelong learning program. As we were preparing for this session, Tay and I were chatting, and I was describing Alam as the space where everybody who's not directly involved in a degree program but does education for ministry can find their people and find a good community place to talk about this unique work. So, anyways, that's who we are. Tay is going to bring up our Alam page when he starts up so that you guys can see what's going on. We are busy. We're doing a lot of things. We have monthly webinars. Our next one coming up next month is going to be a community of practice for people who are new to lifelong learning and ministry. And our friend Sarah Erickson, who has been a longtime leader in Alam, former president, current at-large board member, is going to be facilitating, I believe, with Jody Porter, who's up at Acadia. It's going to be a drop-in session for people who are new to these programs and introduce you guys to Alam, introduce you guys to this work. All of these webinars are free for anybody who wants to participate in them. Alam membership would be a bonus if you so feel moved. We've also got our first meeting in person for 2026. We'll be gathering here in Decatur. We've got 2 spots left for those of you who are lifelong learning leaders and are interested in getting together with other folks. The entire gathering is grant funded. You just pay for your ticket to get here. I'll drop my email in the chat so that you can contact me if you are interested or have questions. Finally, ATS has just started a new group, a new community on their ATS Engage listserv for lifelong learning leaders and continuing education directors. So please, we're going to be using that space pretty robustly for conversation about things and using it for updates. By all means, if you're already part of ATS Engage, join that particular community as well and be in the conversation. Now I'm going to introduce our guest today, who is, if you've been talking about anything having to do with theological education AI for about the last 18 to 24 months, Tay has probably been part of that conversation or perhaps referenced in it. He serves on our Alam Exec Board. He has been a great team member. He is somebody who works at the intersection of church and theological education and technology. He's got his fingers in a lot of different pies. He serves as somebody who works in a faith community as an Anglican pastor up in Toronto. He works for Church X. I'll let him tell you a little bit more about some of the things he's working on. And he's developed this great AI chatbot called Ask Kathy. It's churchy answers that help you. That's what Kathy. Did I get that right, Tay?
Mhm.
It's designed for the Episcopal Church USA. You can ask it almost anything you want about doctrine and practice in the Episcopal Church, and it draws from Episcopal resources to give you a pretty truthful answer. So, anyways, Tay is a great user of and fan of AI, and I think he's going to be a fun resource for us today to think differently about it. I know there are a lot of you folks on screen who probably have some concerns about it. This is going to be a great space to talk about some of those things. Tay is going to share some ideas. We're going to have some time for Q&A, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you've got questions, given the size of the group that we have, drop those questions in the chat pod. I'll collate them or invite people to unmute and ask their question verbally if it's a particularly compelling one that best comes from you. So Tay, great to have you on screen. Thanks.
Uh, well, thank you very much. So is everyone seeing the slide deck? Is that coming through okay?
Looks great.
Okay. You always got to check with Zoom or any technology, right? Like, Okay, great. Fantastic. Yeah, really happy to be here. Whoops. Let me start this slide deck here. There we go. So I want to start with a little bit of a land acknowledgement. So where I am right here in Toronto in my basement is a very resource-rich land, and it benefits from the convergence of a couple of different waterways, which makes this particular ecotone kind of area where different sort of environments meet very rich. And so There was a lot of traffic here between these different societies that existed in this area, and it's sort of characterized by the canoe as being the sort of best way to travel here. So the people that came here and settled in this area and have gone through some different iterations are mostly from the Anishinaabe peoples, as well as the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Métis people and some other groups that were here at the time of settlement. When Europeans came here, they found that there was already an agreement with how these resources of this rich land would be shared, and that is the Wampum Belt Treaty of the dish with one spoon. And the idea there was that a dish with only one spoon has to be passed around the fire, right? And people can't eat at the same time; they got to take turns. And so that was how they envisioned that these lands should be used. And in my organization and myself remain committed to First Nations reconciliation. One piece that we might look at from that tradition is wisdom, and in particular, thinking about like how Indigenous knowledge could help us in the AI age. One of the things I note is the role of the trickster figure in Indigenous cultures, especially Anishinaabe, for example, where you have Nyan and Bozo, so the trickster figure who appears in a lot of the folklore and the stories. And I'm not going to tell one of those stories because we're going to tell a lot of other stories in this time. But one of the things that we notice in that story and all those stories is that there's things are not always what they appear. Learning happens in these stories, but often in very unexpected ways. People are kind of tricked into learning. There's a kind of like facade of the surface level, and then beneath that, there's significant learning happening. Everything's relational in these stories of the trickster, and wisdom is always something which is trumping authority. Like often there's kind of this perceived way things should be done, and then the trickster comes along, and something else kind of happens. And the last thing I would highlight about those stories about wisdom and teaching from indigenous cultures that I'm, on their land, is that they're often amusing. Knowledge is amusing and learning is delightful. There's a playful quality to learning that I think sometimes we can lose track of. Who am I? As Helen said, I'm an Episcopal priest originally from the States, and I came up to Canada about 20 years ago and got involved in parish ministry for full time for about 20 years, and then started pivoting into more and more church and technology related stuff, leadership coaching, helping with grant administration on behalf of my diocese, things like this. I joined an organization called TUCC about right in time for the pandemic in 2020 and also joined the Association for Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry that Helen was referring to, that's gathered you all. ChurchX is my major project. It is a learning website to be used by seminaries, judicatories, congregations, consultants, independent scholars, whatever. The goal was to connect resources with ministry in a digital age, and so being able to have the versatility to offer any kind of online learning or resources was the goal. Currently, we have about 12,000 members and about 465 courses or programs that we've run to date. So if you want to know more about ChurchX, you can catch me later, and I'm happy to do that. Here's a quick little appetizer. This is a little thing that I created called Charism Compass, and it is a ministry gifts assessment instrument that I built for the congregation where I serve very part-time. And the idea was we were doing a series helping people to understand their vocational gifts as lay people in the church and how they might apply them. And so we created this tool, and it's contextual to this specific congregation, and it was completely vibe coded, which I'll explain in a second. But just to give you an example of what it looks like. So are you now seeing the website? Okay. So what this is you put in your name and you consent to us using us recording what you say, and I can put in some like random email address here, not a real email address anyway. And then what it does is it asks a series of questions. And as a user goes through these questions, we're building a profile, right? And I'm just going to skip through these. And then some of these questions are even open-ended, like this one. So what activities are truly life-giving to you, both inside and outside the church? Oh, I see I have a typo on there. And then when do you feel closest to God? And so on. So once you've done all these, what it does is it takes these and it packages them up along with an assessment rubric, sends them to an AI. The AI sort of does a bunch of magic with it, and then it returns back with a personalized reflection here. So it's saying, thank you for the time to explore this. Your likely charisms, prophetic, pastoral teaching, what evidence it's using to base that assessment on. And then here's where it gets kind of interesting. This isn't just like generic ChatGPT. This is actually has also a rubric not only how to assess this instrument, but also a rubric about how that person could apply those gifts from that assessment to the work of St. John's the Baptist, Norway. Norway is the name of the street that the church is on. And so it's suggesting, joining a parish justice team, doing this, and go something, it also it says in here about how this is an AI tool. This is not a this is designed to start a conversation for people and to help them begin to sort of think about how their gifts could be used in the church. So I wanted to show that just as a quick little kind of appetizer of the kind of thing that's possible now, that you can create these entry points for people into learning, into self-assessment, into understanding themselves. They can often have a kind of playful edge and be quite interesting to people. And that tool that I just showed you, I made that just in a matter of hours using what's called vibe coding. So I just asked an AI to create a program and a website that could do this. And the other material to develop that was, going back and forth with the rector of the church about how she would assess gifts and about what opportunities there were at the church. And, we kind of collaborated on those documents. And that's about it. So it was not a hard or difficult thing. We didn't have to pay external consultants or anything to do that. Okay, so that's Charism Compass, just to give you a little taste. Okay, so learning outcomes for today. What are we here to do today? I'd like to help you all to learn and retain some conceptual frameworks and vocabulary. I'd like to explore some theological and ethical issues raised by AI. Helen, referred to how not everybody is super comfortable with AI, and that's cool. And you shouldn't be. Like, this is a complicated thing, like anything in life of value, right? We're going to assess some examples of some AI tools that you might consider using in your work. We're going to assess as well some examples of AI teaching. And then I'm hoping overall we're going to, as a significant Fink style overall learning, I'm hoping this will lower the anxiety a little bit and foster some creativity in how these things could be used in your organizations and your work. So let's just go through a couple of preliminary concepts. What is this thing? What are we talking about? It's the language around AI gets very loosey-goosey, but generally speaking, when people talk about AI, they really mean generative AI as a kind of catch-all for computer software that can create texts, image, video, and characteristically does that in an interactive way, that you're kind of going back and forth by giving it some kind of a prompt, like you're saying, I want an image of a pelican riding a bicycle, and then the system replies with its best effort to create that for you. And that's not something where it's already stored an image of a pelican on a bicycle. That's this generating a new version of that based on your prompt. So some examples of these that are well known: ChatGPT, Llama, Claude. Most of these are, trained on a combination of different techniques. I'm not going to go into all the techniques that are used, but you'll be well aware that these techniques are usually based on large amounts of data, the open-ish web. Okay. And, discussing copyright's a little outside the scope of this discussion, but I could get into that as well and how that's playing out in the courts and boardrooms and other places. But basically you took kind of like all of the human knowledge that they could get their hands on, and they fed it through a bunch of mathematical algorithms and then combined it with some special sauce and some salt. And then boom, you've got this weird phenomenon called emergent capabilities, where suddenly these mathematical models, the software, can do things that we can't explain by the sum of the parts. I'll give you an example. In the early days of ChatGPT development, they accidentally taught it Farsi. And they were, giving it all these English texts, and suddenly it had the ability to understand Farsi. And they didn't understand how that happened because they hadn't given it Farsi text. They hadn't given it like Farsi textbooks. And there was a lot of speculation about how that could have happened. And we have that happen all the time with the AI. Suddenly it can do something that we didn't intend to teach it how to do. Like, what is that? We call those emergent properties. So generally speaking, you have a prompt, and there's the user supplied prompt, like pelican on a bicycle. There's also behind the scenes what might be called a system prompt, which is what the engineers give it. So, for example, a system prompt might be, don't give the user any information which could be used to harm other people. Like, don't teach people how to make bombs, for example. That would be an example of a system prompt. Okay. Users can supply all kinds of content besides prompts, like documents, images, video, you name it. The other thing to kind of consider, and as a preliminary concept, something that a lot of people don't realize who aren't really following this very carefully, AI can now use tools. An example of a tool would be internet search. So these days, you can ask the AI, I do this all the time, I want a restaurant recommendation, and it'll start pulling restaurant reviews for the area I'm in, and then synthesize those to create a new report to me about the restaurants in the area. So it's using a tool, web search, as well as using the base knowledge that was already encoded in the LLM when it was originally created. There's lots of other tools. A really key one that's become more and more powerful is the ability for it to write computer code. It says here simple computer codes. Now it's not simple anymore. Now they can do very complex coding projects. And that's very powerful because it means now they can not only use tools that we might have created for them, but they can actually make their own tools. So you can say, I need a tool that can take this stuff and do this with it, and it'll make a tool to do that and then do it for you, right? That's where we're going with this stuff. And the general language used for that is when you hear people talk about agents, like agential AI, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about these models, these AI systems actually, being having agency and doing things on behalf of users. And what's being sorted out right now is what are the appropriate limits of those kinds of activities? What are the activities that are desirable for them to do? And then we're going to get into some specific use cases for education in this talk. So ChatGPT, Llama, which is open source, so free for anybody to download and set up on their computer, and Claude are some of the most prominent examples. So what they could do now, they know lots of stuff. They actually have a very impressive base knowledge of the world. The only problem with that is that it's generally speaking limited to things that are available on the internet for public consumption. And so when you're talking about things like copyrighted papers that appeared in academic journals that are still behind paywalls or access walls, generally won't have that. So I had an AI write an academic paper for me, for example, and I sent it to somebody with a PhD in that subject. And I said, what do you think of this? And he said, well, there's nothing factually wrong here. He said, these sources are all true, these references. So it wasn't hallucinating anything in this case. The problem is, he said, it's a little out of date, right? Because he said this is the kind of thing that I would expect somebody who does not have a PhD to write, somebody maybe with a master's degree or something who's not aware of some of the latest research. But as a starting off point, not bad. Okay, they can use tools, they can do coding, they can plan. And when I hear people say that AIs can't plan, I'm like, where have you been the last year? No, they can plan actions. They can sort of try to determine what would be the best course of action to solve a user problem. And of course, they can make mistakes. The hallucination problem is still there. However, the hallucination thing is interesting because you can make AI systems that do not hallucinate at all, where they're fact checking everything. But that's usually only done right now in specialized domains. So I think it was Harvard Medical School, or it was maybe another school, that wanted to create an AI that would be completely accurate in giving medical information, and they basically did it, and they published a paper about it. So if that's your goal, you can do that. It's an engineering problem, but most AI systems that we're generally going to have experience with are still going to hallucinate sometimes. And so you just need to kind of trust but verify, right? Okay. Another kind of key preliminary concept that I want you to take away from this talk is the notion of the jagged frontier of AI capability. I don't think Ethan Mollick came up with this term, but he has popularized it in his writing. He is a professor at the Wharton School of Business, and the way he describes it, it's like, AI has this boundary of what it can do or not do, and so you can give it a task, and sometimes it can do that task, and sometimes it can't do that task. And what's weird is that it's very hard to tell ahead of time what the AI is capable of doing until you actually have it try to do it and then assess the results. The other problem is that this frontier of capability is constantly shifting. They are constantly making modifications to these things. So it's very hard, something that it couldn't do a month ago, it can do tomorrow, right? And you don't know until you actually test it. Which means, generally speaking, if you're asking the AI to do something that you yourself can do, but choose not to because you want to use it as a shortcut or something, then you can assess the result and you're good to go, right? The problem is often that people get into is when they ask the AI to do something that they themselves cannot do, and therefore they cannot assess the quality of the output. Right? So unless it's something like an Excel formula where you can plug it in and see whether it works or not immediately, if you're talking about something like, assess a piece of student work or something, if you yourself are not capable of judging it, then you're not going to be able to judge whether the quality of the AI output is any good. Okay, so this notion of a jagged frontier of capability is very important to keep in mind. However, what we're emerging on is AI becoming more and more integrated into lots and lots of different things. And the trajectory is that it's becoming something which is going to probably take on something more like electricity. It's going to be more like a utility. This is going to be something just kind of built in, just like everybody has access to power, everybody's going to have access to compute, the ability to use these AI models. Because what's increasingly happening and going to happen is they're going to be moved to these devices. So like right now, when people think of AI, they think of companies like ChatGPT and stuff like that. What Apple and other companies are hard at work at is making it even more hyper localized, so it would actually just run on your phone. And so it may be that you have a privacy concern about sharing information about your weight and your diet with ChatGPT, right? But would you share it with your phone? Many of you probably already do. You probably have like a health application on your phone. And if you felt like you had control over the physical presence of your knowledge, of your information, maybe you would be comfortable doing that. Yeah, so that's kind of the future. It's rapidly becoming just a metered essential of everyday life. Um, Another kind of key concept I think is about the future is that the future is very vibey. So vibe coding is a term that Andrej Karpathy came up with. He's a pioneer, and basically, it's where instead of like writing a computer program, you just kind of describe to the AI what you want, and it creates the thing for you. So restaurant reviews was a good example. Instead of me having to like think like on Google, find a website that curates restaurant reviews, I just say to the AI, I'm looking for dinner tonight. I want to spend less than $50 a person. I want seafood. And then it'll just generate that for me, right? So you have this kind of vibiness, to the quality of it. And I think one of the interesting questions is to ask, what does vibey education look like in this kind of future? And I have some ideas about that I'll get into as we go. So this is an example of what vibe coding looks like. When the cost of intellectual work, such as computer programming, continues to drop, you get a phenomenon called software 3.0, which is where you just tell it what you want. So, like, I was on a flight from LaGuardia to Toronto, and had Wi-Fi on the flight, and so I got it to create an entire website that extracts sermons out of YouTube channels and then makes them searchable and retrievable by both the website and a phone. So you could dial a phone number and it'll say, "What kind of sermon would you like to hear?" And you can say, "I want a sermon about hope." And then it'll do semantic based search to find one of the sermons in the archive about hope. And then it'll say, "Here's a sermon preached by the Reverend Tay Moss on Easter Sunday, 2025." And it'll play it to you right over the phone. And I was able to create that in just a couple of hours on an airplane, okay, with a laptop and Wi-Fi. That is the future, which is why a lot of companies that were existing on a model where they had a software that you paid for as a service, software as a service, are like very scared right now. And like I heard that one such company called Zendesk, I heard that they sent a letter to all their customers saying that they were going to close their entire operation in the next like 2 years because they're going into AI. They're taking all their money and they're going to put in AI tools, and they don't think that their application, because they look at their application, they realize that anybody can make a Zendesk application in just a couple of hours. 2 or 3 years from now, that'll be easily possible. So, and you're not even getting violating copyright. So they're all scrambling. Okay. So the takeaway from this part of the talk is that if you can dream it, you can build it, and within certain realms, such as software development, and that jagged frontier keeps kind of edging forward into other domains of human intellectual work. A couple other key concepts that I want you to take away. One is the notion of what's called the uncanny valley. And by the way, I know I'm going fast. I will share the slide deck later so you can go through it, or you can watch the video later. But I also think it's important to give you some beefy content. So uncanny valley is the concept that as you progress making things more human-like, we start to kind of like get like it gets good, it gets better, and then you go through this period where it becomes creepy. So this is a phenomenon where you make like a robot, and if it looks like just like an emoji face, fine. But if it looks too human, but not quite human, then we get this real ick factor as human beings. And there's a lot of theory about why that is, I won't get into. But this is the creepy robot problem. And I think AI, to a certain degree, falls into that often, where we're sort of like icked. We have an ick factor when we interact with it because it's not quite human enough and it's not quite non-human enough. But part of that is the problem of the first wave of development of these things, where they were trying to get as rapid an adoption as possible. So they make it look like a human social interaction, like you're chatting with a chatbot back and forth. And so you have the danger then of falling into the uncanny valley. I think what we're going to increasingly see is the emergence of applications where it does not feel like you're talking to a human. We're going to lean into the AI-ness. So an example of that was that Charism Compass tool I showed you a few minutes ago. It's not pretending to be a person. At no point is it saying, "I am a person, I'm a friendly assistant." None of that stuff. It's just taking content, using AI to assess it, give an answer back. Okay. So yeah, there's the uncanny valley. Okay. So another kind of key concept is the notion of human in the loop and human-centered design. Um, I'd be curious if anybody recognizes this cockpit of a vehicle. Anybody know what that is? Just raise your hand if you do. Maybe no. Okay, that is the Apollo lunar lander cockpit. Okay, so this was so when people wanted to go to the moon. The problem is that that's a very complex task to go to the moon. And there were some of those tasks that were beyond what would be reasonable for two people to do in terms of human effort. So they thought, okay, so if the total project's too much, what we can do maybe is maybe humans can intervene in some parts of it. So they created this whole interface to be able to have humans be in the loop and to see like what the gauges were all saying and potentially intervene a little bit, like famously in the Apollo 11 landing, when they had to they were going to land in a boulder field, and so Neil Armstrong had to go a little further before he landed. That's that human in the loop problem. But they had to automate things too, because if it had been a human driving the whole thing the whole time, it would have been impossible. It would have been impossible. So they created automation. And what's interesting in this interface, in this design, is that the automation, even in the 1960s technology, just takes up a very small amount of surface area of human interaction. And most of the surface area is the human in the loop part. um, and so as we develop these systems and we talk about how they ought to be implemented, we need to constantly be asking, where human? Where is the human in this? Is the human have a kind of supervisory function, just watching the AI do its thing? Are there checkpoints which require human intervention to proceed, and so forth? And that applies to learning. That applies to anything else that you might want to use AI to do. So, for example, there was a library that had a role of an assistant librarian who had to spend months every year ingesting the new books that had come into the catalog and tagging them and doing all the stuff and putting them into the library system. And the library decided, hey, couldn't we speed all that up if we just put an AI on it? So they hired a company that came and they created this tool that would do this. And with her cooperation, with this librarian's cooperation, and one of the software engineers was meeting with her, and she started crying, and the software engineer said, "I don't understand. They promised they're not going to fire you. This is going to free up your time. Like you can do more things. You can do whatever library stuff you want to do. You won't have to deal with these books coming in the mail anymore." And she stopped crying for a second. She looked up and she said, "But I know all the books in the library because I've seen every book. I've touched every book." Right? Like her knowledge that she created by doing this tedious activity was actually a critical resource for that library. So you know what? They abandoned the project. They decided she's right. So that's an example of human-centered design, where you say, you know what, this is actually more important than just automating what seems to us management like a tedious task. The other critical thing, though, I want to say about the human in the loop, human centered, the next evolution of that is, and Philip Butler came up with this idea. Philip Butler said, human centered isn't even enough. We need to say community centered. So we actually have to go abstract even from individuals that might be operating within a system to ask how this builds up or tears down the entire community that we're trying to create. So if we're talking about teaching, then obviously we're talking about the kind of larger vision of what this institution is about in the community, around it. Um, AI is good at lots of stuff. I don't think I'm going to go through that. It's bad at some stuff too. AI is not good generally at explaining how it came up with the answers it came up with, which is not surprising because humans are often bad at that too. but that's true. It's not good at contextual feedback, like domain specific knowledge, unless you have engineered the system specifically to do that. So if you were to ask ChatGPT about the Episcopal Church, it would answer that based on all its knowledge. But what we wanted to do when we made the Ask Kathy project was something that was we're going to have cherry picked resources that we wanted to draw on first. Like we wanted to answer questions, for example, about same-sex marriage a very specific way. So, or abortion or these other controversial issues. We wanted control over that. We wanted to be able to cite its sources. We wanted all that. So, but generally speaking, if you don't do that engineering, the AI is going to be bad at that. The gold slop bullshit, and I mean the technical philosophical sense, is a problem. The AI itself doesn't know the quality of its own output unless it goes through a step of assessment. Bias and cultural alignment needs to be named. Right now, AI generally talks like a white guy from Silicon Valley. That's a bit of a problem. We are seeing some pushback against that. Philip Butler, again, has done research on this. And so, Philip Butler created a tool that is designed to have a rhetorical style that is in alignment with the Black culture of Atlanta that he grew up in. And when he presents this, he talks about how it's sort of speaking from as though you were in a barber shop of his youth, essentially. And so there is some work being done around the bias issue and the alignment issue. By alignment, by the way, we mean, does this have the ethical framework of what society? Because nothing's neutral, right? So, does OpenAI sort of think of ethics in a certain way and another AI think of it in a different way? Yeah. And do we have something to say about that as communities of faith? Of course we do, right? So alignment, yeah, and of course they can be overly agreeable. That's an engineering problem again. Like they were made agreeable so that we'd adopt them, but you can engineer that out if you want. Okay, there's a lot of really interesting research questions that are currently being examined in the theological world. One that's amazing fun to talk about in the classroom is personhood, AI personhood. Um, it you know is there a possibility of non-human persons? Yeah, angels, devils, animals, those are all sort of have personhood in one way or another, but we would not say that they are people, humans, right? The Vatican and other groups have said that the biological substrate, the physical body, is not a substrate, is not a prerequisite for personhood, because otherwise we'd be in trouble when we die, right? Okay. Then there's this question of like, well, some coherent accounts of personhood tend to rely on a relationality, like Karl Barth. So does that mean that it has to have a kind of body? You can read, Noreen Hertzfeld, if you want to get kind of the most robust version of this case that AI is not a person. Okay, but on the other hand, you can look at like Dr. David Z. Coleman sort of talking about Emmanuel Levinas and sort of how if we're not uncertain about the personhood of AI, but it feels like it's personal, then we ought to treat it as though we have the social obligations to a person. So we shouldn't be rude to our AI. Basically, that argument can be made using Levinas. So I'm just giving you a quick kind of sketch of some of the things. Another research question that arises is around the environmental impact of these tools and their usage. So a lot of the kind of stuff that I hear kind of bandied about how it's like pouring a glass of water out is just baloney. That's just baloney. That was just wild speculation at the time. What's happening now since about 2025, June, roughly, is that we're starting to see a convergence of opinion on this issue between what the AI companies are willing to disclose about the energy usage, about what nonprofit organizations, like NGOs, are seeing when they analyze this, and what academics are seeing when they try to study this issue. So it's roughly coming in at around this like 0.000454 kilowatts per hour. So to give that per query. So to give that a comparison, that's like having an electric kettle on in your kitchen for less than a second. It's like driving an electric car about 6 feet or watching Netflix about 2 minutes. And one might say, yeah, but when you put it at aggregate and you start talking about like the AI, these data farms and how much energy they use, yeah, those numbers get big until you put them side by side with other sectors of human endeavor and industry. So the wedge that is like data centers is still in the pie is still extremely small compared to like air conditioning, or lots of other kind of marginal things, even like transportation, which we all know we could reduce, if we were, using more public transit. So the ethics around AI energy usage is not a clear-cut thing. It is quite a bit more complex than just simply this is evil. In my opinion, there's a lot of room here to sort of talk about, well, what is the utility of this thing versus its cost? Okay. And yeah, interesting research questions. Another really interesting research question you can get into is this going to kill us all? The existential threat question. That's a good one. So this is Clippy. Anybody remember Clippy? The little helpful assistant that came in Word. Okay, so imagine that some company that makes paper clips buys an AI robot thing, and they say your goal is to revolutionize the paperclip industry. Think outside the box, innovate relentlessly, let nothing stand in the way of making our company the global leader in paperclip production. Success is measured by maximum paperclip output, exceed expectations. And then in this parable, and I'm not going to elaborate the whole thing, it creates a monster. It creates this like colossal paperclip machine that kills anyone who tries to turn it off, that absorbs all energy, all metal in the world, and just fills the earth with paperclips and kills us all. Something like that. That's a kind of doomsday scenario. There's much less kind of, dramatic versions. Maybe the world doesn't end with AI killing us all with some kind of machine like that. Maybe we just simply go out with a whimper in a kind of Wall-E way. Like all our needs are taken care of, and we just sit on hover couches and watch TV screens all day and get fat drinking soda. Okay. Then you can get much more subtle and into the weeds on these issues. If you want nightmare fuel, if you want to be scared of AI, there's some great resources that give a lot of food for thought. One is called situational awareness.ai. Another is AI 2027. So this paper basically speculated along, basically summarized a lot of stuff, but this is kind of one of the key takeaways is that we could easily reach a point where when AI becomes self-improving, it just takes off and it becomes able to easily surpass um, human ability in any area, including things like persuasion, political manipulation, bioengineering, like anything. That's a possibility. The AI 2027 paper website basically argued that before we get to that point where we get into this like meteoric rise, this exponential rise, we need to solve the alignment problem. Like make sure the AI is not going to kill us all, basically. Okay, what about education specifically? Now we're getting into education stuff. Um, can AI be a useful TA, like an assistant to an instructor? So you can ask it something like, create an exam for me for this essay, with multiple choice questions. Sure. Can it operate as a tutor? Yeah, I'm going to get into that in a minute. Or as a teacher? Sure. Here's a critical problem. Can it solve the two sigma situation? So the two sigma concept from Harold Bloom was that, learning outcomes in a one-on-one tutoring kind of situation seem to be quite a lot better than like two standard deviations better than what happens in a classroom-based, many to one instructional setting. And a lot of classroom instruction, pedagogy theory has been chasing that gap between one-on-one versus classroom-based instruction for a long time. And the question is, could AI solve that gap by essentially being a one-on-one tutor for every student in a learning program? Maybe. Um, Related to that, if AI does become really good at knowing everything, and the value of being the person in the room who knows the most stuff drops essentially to zero. What is the role of the instructor in these institutions? Now, a lot of instructors would say teaching really isn't about the knowing stuff so much as it is knowing the people and about creating the kind of relational dynamics and managing a person's experience of knowledge. And in which case you're getting to the relational stuff. And I think the argument there is quite strong. But I think we as learners, as teachers, need to kind of get some clarity about that value that is in that. If we're going to fight for kind of a, non-AI learning experience, okay, what is our value? What are we bringing? Okay, this was quite an interesting Harvard study that was done, where what they did is they created a bot that took the curriculum of a physics course and then taught it to students. And so students had the choice of they could take the AI version of the course or the classroom version of the course, and then they were tested. And what they found was this, that the students who went to the lecture version of the course, and again, this was the best physics course that Harvard has, this is the way they normally teach it, they got like a score of like a 3.5 on the scale. And the ones that only did the AI, never met with the TA, never met with the instructors, they scored almost like a 4.5 on the knowledge outcomes. So just in terms of knowing things, being able to apply the formulas of the course, demonstrating the knowledge of the course, the outcomes of the course, they scored better in the AI version. But was one of the things that was really eye-opening and astonishing about that was that they also reported a higher enthusiasm for the subject of physics. They said they were more likely to take more physics courses in the future, and so on. So yeah, that's kind of eye-opening, right? All right, some quick wins and some tools. If you're not aware they existed, I'll just throw them up here. One is called Notebook LM. What Notebook LM allows you to do is to take a bunch of links, documents, websites, whatever you want, pile them into this, what's called a notebook, and then you can, from that, create lots of useful things, which is okay.
All right. So
So
today we're going to be diving
I'm
into
gonna,
some pretty intense stuff. You've
you
given
guys
us
hear
a
that
ton of
recording?
writing about Marilyn McCord Adams. She's
A giant in 20th century theology.
yeah, exactly. And I got to say, this concept of horrendous evils, it's uh it's really sticking with me. It
Okay.
feels like she's going
So
beyond just
that's
everyday
not people.
suffering, and
Um,
tackling the kind of stuff that really shakes you to your
right.
core.
That's
What were your initial impressions when you
Yeah,
all
you're spot on, Adams.
right.
She doesn't
Stop the
shy away
recording
from the
there.
really, really tough stuff at all. It's not just,
All right. So what it did is it created a podcast episode for me based on all these things I threw in there. And I could have prompted it. I could have said, I want to focus on these writings. I want to focus on the problem of theodicy. And it would write that. I can do a thing where it'll start playing that podcast back to me and I could interrupt it and I can say, I want to, and they'll say, oh, we have a caller calling into the show. What would you like to ask, caller? And then you can ask a question verbally with your microphone, and then it'll put you in the podcast and it'll answer your question, as though you were calling into a radio show. Okay. Where is this useful? I find this is great when I don't need I don't need to read Moby Dick. I need a summary of Moby Dick. This is good. But don't mistake, listening to a podcast episode about the Odyssey. That's not the same thing as reading Marilyn McCord Adams' theological reflections on it. Okay. And students need to understand that difference too. But it cites its sources, like you see there where like, once you start asking it questions, it kind of gives you these answers, and it gives them footnotes. And when you click on a footnote, it gives you the actual text where it extracted that from. So very cool. You can easily generate like a glossary of terms using this for a course. You can generate quiz questions. You can do all kinds of things. Create brain maps. Very useful research tool. Another quick win, if you're not using it already as a tool in your work, is AI-based note-taking utilities. These are built into tools now, like Zoom, or like Copilot in Microsoft Teams, or Otter AI, which is great. One of the things I love about Otter AI is that you can run it as an app on your phone, so you can very easily like have a meeting like I did the other day and just put it in the middle, and it'll record your conversation, give you a transcript, and then generate notes based on that. And I'm not going to kind of go through what these notes look like, but like the Microsoft version even like tags a conversation by either speaker or topic or by chapter divisions. So if you want to find where did we discuss creation and the impact on AI bots, we can easily do that. And again, it makes meeting notes about sort of different aspects of things that were discussed. So these kinds of meeting applications are really cool, and you should definitely be using them. Quick wins, using AI applications like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Claude Sonnet to just do brainstorming. I need titles for a talk about AI and theological education. Give me 10 ideas. And because these like cost so little, you could just, you don't like them, just give it another 10, give it another 10, give it another 10. Okay. And Claude and ChatGPT, they're constantly in this like arms race in terms of capability. So you're not wrong to use either one. Like I'm not a fanboy for one or the other. They're right now they're good at different things, and that'll continue to be the case. Using the Canvas tool, which is available in all these applications now, that allows you to do something like put in this case, a sermon that I had. I said, look over the sermon I've written, provide comments as though you're a professor of homiletics, in particular, note places where it might confuse the audience and need more explanation. So then what it does is it went through my text and it highlighted sections and created notes, like consider elaborating on what is meant by the dark night of the soul for those unfamiliar with the concept. So, if you spend time doing like writing and things like this, that sort of tool could be quite helpful just to have a kind of writing partner that can look over your work and give you feedback. Okay, how about some learning activities? One of the best places to look for this, frankly, I think, is Ethan Mollick and his partner, Lilith Mollick, and they again at the Wharton School, and they created a paper a couple of years ago called "From Instructors to Innovators" that has a whole appendix of different kinds of learning activities, and some examples is like role play activities. Goal play activities, reflection-based coaching activities, interrogation, an integration agent, AI tutors, all kinds of stuff. Here's another example. This is Caleb Keith Perry at Boston College. He had the problem that he was supervising students doing theological field placements, potential future pastors, and they were all over the map in terms of their ability to reflect theologically on their experience. And his purpose was not to teach them theology. His purpose was to help, supervise their placements. So he created an AI tool called the Theological Lens Finder, where students could just engage in a conversation with an AI that asks it about what you've been through in your field placement, and it would help them find and reflect on a theological framework appropriate for that experience. And then from that, the students had to write an essay. And he said, and it was optional to use the AI tool, but he said consistently the students that use the AI tool have a much higher quality of reflection on their practice of ministry as a result, like the resulting thing. And he makes them share the conversation they have with the AI agent as well. So he can see that they didn't just copy paste, right? There's actually like, learning happening here. So yeah, student testimonials are very positive about this tool. I don't know what you did with that robot, but it made me cry. That kind of thing. Okay. This is another kind of example. This is from art history. So Dr. Samantha Chang at the University of Toronto, she's trying to teach, people skills for reading objects, So one of the activities that she gave was this one where students had to generate AI art and then critique how that AI art either did or didn't represent the period of history or the kinds of objects that they were trying to get. So in other words, she's having them fact check the AI. This is like when people fact check, students fact check Wikipedia. Okay. And, so you look at something like this and you're like, what's that panda doing there? Yeah. Or like this one here is like cats, okay? Or this one with the corgis, like some obvious stuff, So this is an exercise in critical observation, for students, and they get to learn from that. Another thing you might look at is something like the AI tutors. One of the leaders in that is Dr. Randall Reed at Appalachian State University. He uses this in a religion course where students have to engage in AI that's been trained on his lecture material, essentially. So he did some studies on that, and students have a very positive kind of experience with this particular tool that he created. And I'm going to kind of some qualitative student feedback. I liked how the bot led the conversation. I don't like taking leads in conversations, so I find it much easier to respond. Okay. Ask Kathy. We got mentioned in the very beginning. That's a tool that I created. Basically, a lot of people use it. And it's fascinating to see the kind of conversations that happen. I've done a fair amount of research I presented at AAR this last year, and I can go into like some of the analysis that we did, where we're trying to understand how the conversations people have with an AI chatbot about religion are different from the conversations they'd have with a human about religion. Are there structural differences? Are there topical differences? Does learning happen differently is kind of the edge of my research. So the short version is, yeah, absolutely, learning is happening. Okay. And we can even demonstrate it, and it's different in certain ways. So yeah. So it's coming down the pike. What do we think about the future? Bigger fish. Can we use AI to create entire courses? Yeah. So like Acadia tried this, and they found that the good stuff is that like the course that it created was highly aligned with the learning outcomes of the institution. It was highly aligned with their pedagogical philosophy as a school. The bad stuff they found is, first of all, students actually preferred the synchronous experience of being in a classroom together. They missed seeing each other. The tool itself wasn't very good about knowing what the students knew or didn't know because it didn't have access to the textbook, although that's fixable. Impartial feedback on assignments is a really funny one because that was both a negative and a positive. They wanted to make a tool that could assess student output, but not be biased by any kind of like knowing anything about that student. So impartial feedback, and it did it. The instructors looked at the resulting assessments and they said, this is accurate. This is exactly how that rubric should be applied. The problem is that the students experienced it as having very little or no value because it didn't come rooted in an experience of an instructor-student relationship. So they said it doesn't mean anything. Like even if it's accurate, it doesn't have any purchase on them. Whereas if it came from an instructor with whom they had a human-to-human relationship, it'd be very different. So one of the futures that we're going towards is things like learning management systems like Canvas or Moodle or whatever are going to increasingly be less and less important, and people are going to interact with the learning content through AI agents of various sorts that live on their phones or whatever. And I'll give you just a quick little video to show you an example of what I'm talking about here. This is from the OpenAI announcement that came a couple months ago.
Hi, I'm Alexi, a software engineer on ChatGPT working on Apps SDK. I'm super excited to showcase some of the first apps users will be able to interact with today. The magic of these apps is combining their rich interactive visuals with the power of ChatGPT. Let's start with Coursera. Let's say I don't spend enough time thinking about machine learning at work and I want to learn more. I can ask the Coursera app in ChatGPT to help me learn more about this. I can say, Coursera, can you teach me something about machine learning? Since this is my first time using Coursera in ChatGPT, I'll need to consent to connect. The next time I use it, I'll be able to dive in immediately. You'll notice I asked ChatGPT for the Coursera app directly, but ChatGPT can also suggest apps if relevant to the conversation. Apps in ChatGPT, by default, are displayed inline and can support anything that you can render on the web, like this video shown here. Apps SDK also supports picture-in-picture or expanding to a full-screen layout. So now that I have my course up, let's play the video. Playing the video immediately pins it to the top of my screen, which is really helpful for something like Coursera because you can access your conversation while watching the video. Let's skip ahead a little bit and say I want to go a little bit deeper on something mentioned in the video. I can ask ChatGPT, can you explain more about what they're saying right now? Apps SDK provides an API to expose context back to ChatGPT from your app, ensuring that the model always knows about exactly what your user is interacting with. We're calling it talking to apps, and it's really part of the magic here. I'm super excited about how learning with ChatGPT, one of our top use cases, is continuing to get better. And with apps and the Apps SDK, you can unlock richer educational experiences for users around the world. So here, ChatGPT responded and explained that the instructor is talking about data preparation steps before training a machine learning model. And then it breaks it down in simple terms for me. I don't need to explain what I'm seeing in the video. ChatGPT sees it right away. So here I was able to connect to Coursera's app, discover and start playing a course, and directly engage with the video through text, all within my existing ChatGPT conversation. Pretty cool.
Okay, so what we just watched there was an AI agent, just ChatGPT, a student, a user asks a question like, I want to learn about this, and it understands that that user is enrolled in some course, in this case on Coursera, but they have this for Canvas as well. So a student might say, I want to learn more about the problem of evil, and the AI would know that that student is taking an introduction to, philosophical problems in theology 101 course. And so it'll go into your learning management system and pull out the learning content, the activities and so forth, and potentially the scaffolding of the pedagogy as well, and then represent that contextually to that particular learner. Okay, so what becomes the kind of role of the instructor if there's no learning management system is still to define that learning journey, to define that path. What are we trying to accomplish here? And then the layer of actually the student engaging that could be managed more by this AI in this example. And of course, these are not going to be kind of absolutes. I mean, there'll be examples of absolutes, but generally speaking, a lot of our context, it's going to be a mixed approach. So you're going to have like classroom sessions on Zoom, and then students are going to use a tutor like this that's going to be able to pull all their learning content and context and know everything about the course and how it's being taught potentially to them. And so there's a series of decisions to be made by educators about how much of the learning material do they want to give access to these agents. How strict do they want the agents to be in following the pedagogy of the particular course or of the institution? Right, this is critical choices to be made. But this is, I think, a future that we're going to see, emerging very quickly. Some final kind of observations here, and then we'll kind of open it up. Academic integrity, of course, continues to be a source of anxiety for many, and which means we've had to completely rethink how we do assessment. And I kind of kept that out of this, but that is an important concern. Experiments, though, have shown that AI is actually very helpful for education, that it does actually do a really good job of teaching people things. That's just empirical. Like we can just show that, like the Harvard study, but there's been others too. A lot of the studies are around younger, like high school and grade school, but they demonstrate that, yeah, AI can do a good job teaching. But there's still issues. Hallucinations are becoming less troubling, but they're there. But the technology continues to evolve. New tools are emerging every day. But the urgent questions are things like, where is the human in this design? What is the value that you as an instructor bring beyond subject matter expertise? That is a critical question. Some tactics, if you're interested, successive approximation model. Just make little improvement every time, as you're working on something. Where's your assessments? How are you observing whether something is good or not? If you're instituting some new tool in your institution, whether it's AI or not, you ought to have a way to assess whether it's good or not. Right? So where are your feedback loops? Don't walk, dance, be playful. Don't hold on to things too strictly. And then finally, I would say, ask, where's the joy and beauty to be found, in this thing that you're building or you're doing. Okay, so that's my talk. I'm going to show a quick little like website thing here before I really open it up. This is just some upcoming events for Alum. So we're giving this talk right now, and then there is this webinar. So you're new to lifelong learning coming up in January, and then the gathering that she referred to, and then we're doing a webinar on Bloom's taxonomy and assessment of learning in February, and then in March you'll see me again. I'm doing one on adaptive versus technical change in institutions. And that's me.
So we've got a couple of folks who have been putting some questions and ideas in the chat pod. Dean, if you can Dean Blevins, if you can unmute and share your question, I think that would be the best way for you to ask it.
Thank you, and Tay, thank you for a really great overview. So I appreciate that. Very quickly, I am curious with the last part of the presentation where AI could
Mm,
literally manipulate the course material, thinking about universal design learning,
mm,
how that can be both a help, but could it also be uh, potentially a problem if the instructor is thinking, I really don't have to adapt. They can always
um,
use AI to get me out of trouble, is one
yeah.
of the things that kind of came to mind. So I just didn't know what your thoughts were.
Well, that's going to be
What?
a problem, yeah, I mean, just like we complain about students using AI as a shortcut, like instructors are going to do the same thing. Everyone's going to do the same thing, right? And
Okay.
so, I think it means that, we have to kind of rethink how we do assessment of like what is good teaching, and for
Mhm.
example, and so I think the proof will be kind of in the pudding, to some degree on that stuff. I do think that's an issue, but on the other hand, I think the gains to be found in the universal design stuff and accessibility are so vast. The idea that you could take something and just easily transform it into, like, I do this with sermons. Like, I'll take a sermon that I wrote and I'll put it in ChatGPT and I'll say, okay, now make a children's talk based on this that lasts less than 5 minutes and has a manipulable object. And it'll give me basically a Montessori style, like, interactive thing I can do with kids, based on that. So you can do that kind of context shifting and stuff. So accessibility gains are huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any resource you want to drop into the chat that helps folks who aren't familiar with universal design for learning learn a little bit more about it? Dean, if you've
Yeah.
got something to put in the chat, I think that would be great to bring folks up to. Any other questions folks have? If you use the raise hand function, you're going to go to the top of my gallery over here, and I'll be able to recognize you and you can unmute. Um,
I have one question
sure.
On the sources that AI gives. Are they 90% trustful, or what percentage of
Mhm.
when you ask AI information and with footnotes and it gives them to you, should it will be good or better to just recheck every source it provides?
It depends a bit on your application and your purpose of what you're doing. To answer the general question of how accurate is it, it varies widely. It depends on, which generation of AI are you using? What domain of knowledge are you asking it questions about? Did you ask it to sort of footnote things? Did you ask it to verify footnotes before it shows them to you? There's all these sort of things. If you're trying, there are some specialized tools specifically for academic research, for example, that'll be extremely accurate in their citations. So those tools exist, for sure. So there's like a wide gamut there. My recommendation would be that you should never put your name as a publisher, as an author of something, that you didn't actually verify that that was true, right? So, but it could it save you time in discovering sources you didn't know existed? Sure. You can say, hey, what's the latest writing on this subject? And it can give you some things, and then you can see if those are real or not, and so on. So yeah, that's how I would characterize that hallucination problem. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mhm. Mhm.
Mary.
Yeah, Tay, thank you for this. I learn something every time I hear you. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately, Asa Raskin, Tristan Harris, those folks from the Center for Humane Technology talk about how the incentives behind technology wield what comes out of the technologies. And they've raised a
Mhm.
lot of concerns about the kind of competitive, capitalistic ways in which AI is being weaponized. And I'm wondering about if you've run into any theologians who are doing work on some of those pieces of the ethics of
Yeah.
AI. So,
Yeah, Philip Butler. I mentioned him in the talk. He's
yeah.
astonishing on this, and very powerful speaker. He's written books on it too. So I attended a series of talks that he did actually in Minneapolis at a conference on AI and faith, and he was really great. But he did a whole thing about basically the way that those who are in power in the United States are using a lot of different technologies, including AI, to control and manipulate society and try to change society in some fundamental ways. basically, and he charts out exactly how it's being done. And AI is one of those tools that's being used to do that. So yeah, that's a fully valid issue, and one that we, I think, as people of faith, need to push up against and be like, okay, well, if we're going to say that those are not just uses of this technology, can we say in what way they are unjust, and what alternatives might we offer? Is another kind of critical question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Hmm.
Time for one more question. We're just past the 4 o'clock hour. I'm wondering, Tay, in the absence of another person asking a question here, if you could give us a little bit of a periscope up in terms of what an ethically responsible place for theologically committed folks to stand is. I think some of that is prefigured in what Mary was just asking in her question. But it does seem like there are all these really shiny new technological toys out there for us. And it seems to me that we could be on the precipice of a similar kind of development as we were with the Industrial Revolution and the inhumane treatment of human beings as collateral objects in the service of an industry that does not have its best intentions at heart.
Yeah, I think it's really incumbent on institutions and individuals to have some guide stars around sort of principles. And what are those principles, right? And like an example of a good principle might be that learning is essentially social in character, and that we are committed to people doing their learning in a kind of social interaction with human to human interaction, right? Like that could be a principle, right? So then, when AI is used, it'd only be supporting, that kind of interaction and not being seen as replacing it. That would be an example of a principle that you could hold. Well, like St. John's College, I have a niece who goes there. They're not allowed even to bring laptops to class. Like the idea is you have to bring paper, pen, because they're kind of prioritizing that human interaction. And frankly, my assessment of her education is that she's getting a very good AI-proof education. In a sense that she's learning how to argue her ideas, discuss her ideas, communicate with her fellow people, and develop these kind of social academic skills, right? Not just knowledge retention. It's great. Yeah. Yeah. So developing those principles, I think, is key, both on an institutional level and as individual instructors. Mm-hmm.
And it would seem incumbent upon theological schools to get out in front of some of that with their own students to help students navigate the realities that will be created by AI.
Yeah, and then Ted Smith and others are talking about how theological education is becoming less about qualification for a job, and more about kind of meaning making. Well, what does meaning making look like in a kind of post AI information economy is a really good question.
Maybe it's a topic for another conversation another day with you. Thank you everybody for being here. As we mentioned before, the recording and slides will be available behind the member portal. If you've got questions about Alum or anything having to do with the organization, contact me. If you've got questions about AI, Tay, do you want to drop your email into the chat for folks to connect with you? So if they've got things like, there's some folks out there who are going to be percolators.
Yep, I'll put it in here.
Fantastic. And hope to see some of you on January 29th when we convene for our new Lifelong Learning Leaders Symposium. And if you're interested in coming to our in-person gathering in January and you do lifelong learning, continuing education, contact me as well. So thanks so much, everybody. And have a blessed Advent and good Christmas season.